This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I have Mitchell Hadley back, and we're going to be talking about Hawaii Five-0, the original series that started in the 1960s and lasted until 1980, and the conversation will begin in a moment. The subject is Hawaii Five-0, the spy and cop show from the 1960s that lasted until 1980, starring Jack Lord. I think it's one of the more underrated TV shows in American history, and I'm going to talk about why I think it's also a great show with Mitchell Hadley. Mitch has appeared on a number of shows before with me, as well as a recently started series on American TV through the decades. So welcome, Mitch. For anyone who hasn't seen you on any of those shows, can you give a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me on, Dan. Good to see you again. I'm a television historian. I look at culture and television history. I write about it at itsabouttv.com, which you can see up on the screen there. I'm also the author of The Electronic Mirror, which is a collection of essays on television and its impact on and impact by cultural history in America. So that is, those are my creds. And right now, I'm sorry I didn't wear a Hawaiian shirt today, but I'm ready to go.
So one of the things before we start talking about the history of the show, how it got on the air, and the various themes, etc. I just want to talk about a few pop cultural things that just came to my mind as I was preparing for the show, and one of them is that I think Hawaii Five-0, for some reason, is one of the more underrated classic American television shows, especially from that era. At some point, I think we're going to do Mission Impossible and The Fugitive, and those shows have had a large impact in the sense of Mission Impossible with the later movie series. The Fugitive also had a movie, but it also had the highest rated ending until the ending of MASH came along. But somewhere along the line, it seems to me that the original Hawaii Five-0 has gotten lost. People don't speak of it with the same kind of affection or appreciation, generally speaking, as they do those two shows I mentioned, as well as some other shows. Do you think that my perception is correct? And if so, how would you account for that?
I think your perception is correct on that, and it does puzzle me to a certain extent, considering that Hawaii Five-0 has stayed on TV in reruns, first in syndication and now on a lot of the free streaming services. So it's not as if the show left the consciousness of people, that they weren't able to see it out of sight, out of mind. But if I had to guess, I would say that there are a couple of reasons why it perhaps isn't remembered the way it should be. One of them could well be Jack Lord himself, because he has this, you get this impression of Lord with the hair that doesn't move, this very upright, almost rigid police officer in a time when things were getting very countercultural in the country. And despite the fact that Lord himself was very much against guns, and the show did take on certain topical issues, but it was not a topical show in the sense that many dramas of the time were, or were starting to evolve into. And so I think between that and the fact that that Steve McGarrett is to a certain extent kind of an easy character to poke fun at.
Yeah.
And part of that is from the time, part of it just carries over because people do something like that. But if you didn't know better, you might suggest that McGarrett was a character from Saturday Night Live or from SCTV. It's not fair, it's unfortunate, but I think that there may be something of that involved. If you look at the remake, and we're not talking about the remake, I know, but in the remake, the McGarrett character is very much an action, adventure, explosions type of a hero, and he also has a personal life. Jack Lords McGarrett has no personal life except for an occasional reference to one. And as I said, he's very solid, very upright. He's not an action adventure hero. He's a man who issues orders, who gets involved directly, book 'em Dano,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So he's cut out of the mold of the hero that you would have seen in the earlier days of TV, but not the contemporary days.
Yeah, he's almost sort of midway between the modern action hero and the old Bookham Joe Friday kind of thing.
And if you read any of interviews that Jack Lord gave in the '60s, and I'm thinking back to when he was on Stony Burke, the modern cowboy show, Lord considered himself personally to be kind of a successor to the Gary Cooper type of actor.
Mm.
Strong, upright, if not exactly silent. He let his actions do the talking for him. And so I think it's not a surprise that he would choose to portray McGarrett in that same way.
Yeah, now that you mention it, he does have that very much Gary Cooper kind of appeal. And you mentioned the reboot, and I think it's a reboot. It's not the McGarrett. The
You're
McGarrett, the new
correct.
one, is not the son or the grandson of the original Gary. It's
The
rebooted.
same,
I
presumably the same one.
Yeah,
Yes.
sometimes on breaks at work, in my breaks or a lunch break or something, sometimes people have TVs going on. I'd see that show. I'd see something like Blue Bloods with Tom Selleck. And there's just such a generic quality to all of these action cop shows. The fast cutting. Whenever something serious, it's lit in blue. It seemingly. Uh, uh, and it just it could have taken place anywhere to me. It could have been Hawaii. It could have been in San Francisco, the streets of San
Hmm.
Francisco. It could have been a New York cop show. It could have been in London, by the BBC. Whereas the original Hawaii Five-O seemed to play on the fact that it was set in Hawaii. Hawaii hadn't been a state for even 10 years when it came on. So
Right.
there was an exoticness about it. I mean, the famous opening with the hula dancer and whatnot. I mean, it reeked of Hawaii, and it was and not that the new show didn't cast locals in Hawaii, but it seemed to be much more drenched in Hawaii rather than a generic cop and spy show.
Yeah, and it was all filmed on location except for a few location scenes they might film back in the U.S. But you're right, they played up the atmosphere, the exotic nature of Hawaii. As you pointed out, it hadn't been a state for that long, so there was an excitement about Hawaii, and I think that comes through in the series. And I think that by doing it all there, as opposed to its predecessor, Hawaiian Eye, which was an ABC
Yeah.
detective series, which took a few shots of Hawaii and did a lot of the rear projection type of
Mm.
thing to give you the idea. But Hawaii Five O really was Hawaii,
Yeah.
and they brought the culture of the island into it. They brought the history into it, some of the phraseology that natives would use there. So it was, I think, a very beautifully done bit to incorporate the local color the way it did.
Yeah, and you mentioned the themes. You mentioned the Dano phrase as someone named Dan. I've heard that. I've had people use that. Book 'em Dano a lot. That
Hmm.
Dan the man or Book 'em Dano is like anyone named Dan. Here's that. But that and also we talked on an earlier show about some of the classic theme songs of the 1960s. And Hawaii Five O has to be a top 10 all time. Just the with the
Yeah.
rolling drums, and then ba
Hmm.
ba 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 ba, and then Jack Lord turns around, freeze frame, da 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 da. It just is infectious.
It is, and it puts you in the mood for the show from the very start. It's
Yeah.
going to be
And
fast
the big
paced action.
wave.
Yep. Oh, yeah, that's just great. And what I particularly like about the opening is that the music and the video work so well together.
Yeah.
They're edited brilliantly into that, and it gives you an immediate sense of what the show is going to be. And you're right, that theme music was a big hit. I think it went to number 4 on the charts. It was memorable, and it is fun to
Yeah.
see. Everybody should recognize it.
And the new show seems to mute it down a little bit, and I only have seen a handful, maybe 3 episodes of the new show versus what was it, 220 something of the
Yes.
old show, and although I was surprised to read in looking it up that the new show actually I think had more episodes than the old show, like 240 versus 229 or something, because I was shocked that it ran 10 seasons, but. Um, uh, Let me just talk about Jack Lord then. One of the interesting things is his pre Hawaii Five O career. Two things that really stood out to me is one, he was the original Felix Leiter in the James Bond, the early James Bond. I think he appeared in 2, I believe, and then also that he was one of the finalists to become Captain James T. Kirk on the original Star Trek, but he wanted a piece of the show, and Roddenberry wouldn't give it to him. Do you
Yep,
know anything about both of them?
that's what I've heard as well. That he wanted a piece of the action
Yeah.
to use a Star Trek theme, and Roddenberry wouldn't do it, and so he withdrew himself, as it were, from contention for that. But yes, he was in Bond. The first one. There's a story that he wanted Felix to be more of a co-star in the stories going forward. Wanted him to have an expanded role in the movie series, and that was a sticking point as to why he didn't continue in the role. Now, I should say at the outset that Jack Lord was not exactly the most popular figure in Hollywood, in television. He was driven, he was a perfectionist, he rode people hard. He had an ego, they all do, but in talking about himself as the successor to Gary Cooper, he had a very high standard for himself as well. So whenever you hear stories like he wanted Felix Leiter to co-star in the Bond movies, you always have to keep that in mind, that there are a lot of people who would like to portray Lord in a lesser light. And so we may never know exactly what the extent of that was, but you are correct. 2 prominent roles there. And then he got into Stony Burke, which I alluded to earlier. It was a single season show on ABC. It was what you would call a modern cowboy
Hmm.
series. He played this young rodeo star, Stony Burke, his first year out on the rodeo circuit, with the goal of winning the year end championship in bronc riding or bull riding. And it was a very interesting show, had a very good supporting cast, including Bruce Dern, Warren Oates, figures that you would recognize from westerns. And it was an interesting experiment to take westerns into the modern era, because again, he plays Stony Burke as someone from the Dakotas with an old fashioned sense of right and wrong, honor, dignity, not unlike McGarrett, actually. If you wanted to imagine that Steve McGarrett was a rodeo star before he became head of Hawaii Five-O, it's not a stretch to see those as both coming from the same reservoir. And I think that's due to Jack Lord's portrayal of both of those roles. But Stony Burke ran for 1 season. It was a very good show, and it actually made it out onto DVD back in the days when a lot of shows from the early 60s were getting exposure. So I would encourage anybody, as a side note, that if you get the opportunity to catch a few episodes of Stony Burke, it's worth your time.
You mentioned how parodyable Jack Lord's performance as McGarrett is, and obviously, probably the biggest parody character of all time is Captain Kirk, and I just wonder what would have happened had Lord gotten the role. He's got that famous Steve McGarrett squint. When something happened, he'd turn around to Dan, he'd squint at him and give him say,
Hmm.
take Kamala or whatever, whoever it was, out to Stony Point or wherever. Um, uh, uh, what do you think about Lord's acting style, just briefly?
It is. It would be seen today as I think, kind of wooden, um, because he doesn't let his guard down a lot. He doesn't open himself up in the way that our modern heroes do. So I think contemporary audiences might find his style to be a little stiffer than they're accustomed to. But if you look back at Lord's performances in some other shows from the era, he was, for example, a guest star on The Untouchables. He appeared as a guest star in many shows of the time, both as the good guy and as the bad guy. So it's interesting to see him from that point as well. But he does get more expressive in some of these other shows where he's not quite as superficial, perhaps, or one-dimensional as McGarrett can tend to be. So I think he was a very good actor, but he was from an acting school that is a little out of favor now, perhaps, with the kind of modern emotive men that we see on TV. McGarrett and Lord, I would say, play very masculine characters in an era where masculinity has that toxic overtone.
Yeah. Just to keep on the Star Trek thing for one more point, I recently saw a few days ago that Paramount Plus released Star Trek Strange New Worlds out onto YouTube, so you could watch them for free. And so I did, thinking really that it was going to be bad because Picard I thought was really bad, and the few episodes I thought of Discovery I thought were really bad. But I was shocked with how good Strange New Worlds was. I mean, it really hewed closely back to the original Kirk era Star Trek in terms of having kind of wacky planets with sort of human-like aliens, plus really well developed characters. And I was thinking about uh, they were smart enough to finally, after who knows how many series, go back to what originally worked 60 years ago, and it's working now in the 2020s. And I thought about the Hawaii Five-O reboot, and like I said, how generic it was.
Hmm.
Just off the top of my head, have you seen the Strange New Worlds from Star Trek? And if so, how do you think a show like, or why do you think a show like the reboot of Hawaii Five-O didn't match creatively the
Hmm.
success of the original?
Well, I think that there are two things involved in there. I think that with Star Trek, I have not seen the new one, although I've read enough about it that I would concur with the way with your take on it. I think that with Hawaii Five O, the network looked at this as intellectual property. And so they were able to put out a reboot of the series, and they were cashing in on the name, the fact that the show was known, recognizable, available, but they didn't have any investment in the actual characters or story the way people who do Star Trek tend to. And so it kind of goes without saying that if you're a Star Trek aficionado, if you're involved in continuing the story, even if you're doing it as a prequel or a continuation of the original series rather than one of the later ones, you've got some kind of an emotional investment in that. You want to make sure that it's true to the characters that you recognized from when you were watching it. And so, considering that Star Trek has that backstory, you're almost forced as somebody doing the show to respect that. Whereas with the new 5 and with so many of these new shows where you're rebooting it as opposed to doing a continuation of it, You're right. It's generic enough that it could have been called anything, and they said, "Well, let's stick a name on it
Yeah.
because let's find an IP that we own that has a recognizable name that we can just slap on there." I know we've got this studio in Hawaii. We haven't been doing anything since Magnum. Let's go out there. Let's do that. Let's call it Hawaii 5-0 and we'll borrow the names. But the characters are just stock characters from today's television. They are representative of today's heroes, representative of today's storylines. They're not trying to do anything different. And you're right, they could have called it anything, but I think they said, let's use a name that the public is going to recognize and see if it'll stick.
Yeah.
And I could be wrong about that. And if I'm impugning the motives of anybody who is doing the reboot, I apologize for that. But I will say that it gives off that kind of vibe.
Yeah.
And even if you can't judge somebody by their motives, you can judge them by the output.
Yeah. And I've heard that Magnum PI is under discussion for being rebooted again. And that was actually another show maybe we should do a show
Hmm.
on in the future too, because that's probably the only show set in Hawaii that I think came close to Hawaii 5-0. It had a little, it's a little lighter, it's a little bit more humorous, but I think that was also an excellent and underrated show.
And
But
it also exists in the same universe as Hawaii 5-0
oh, it
because
does.
especially in the early going, Magnum would occasionally make reference to 5-0.
Hmm.
We better bring 5-0 in on
Ah,
this,
okay.
or even a couple of times he would drop McGarrett's name. And I
Hmm.
understand that they talked to Jack Lord and tried to have him do a cameo appearance as McGarrett, but for whatever reason, whether it wasn't a good offer, or whether he was tired of the character, or just felt that let's let it lie. That never happened. But they did exist in the same universe, and since there is no such thing in real life
Yeah.
as Hawaii 5-0, the references to 5-0 can only be seen as a reference back to the series.
Yeah, that's interesting to know. And speaking of, you talked about a piece of the action. I think Jack Lord eventually did get a sizable chunk of the show after about 4 or 5 years, and so he made mint on the show. And
Yeah.
I don't think he did anything afterwards, did he?
No, he did he was involved in a pilot for another series set in Hawaii, and I think originally the thought was that he might star in it or appear in it, even though he would not be dominating the action. He would be, uh, when you see some of the later series that Raymond Burr is in, for example, like Kingston Confidential, where it's very much of an ensemble series, and he's just kind of there that may have been the kind of a show that Lord was talking about, but for whatever reason, his on screen participation didn't go and it never got beyond the pilot stage. So that was pretty much the extent of that.
And one of the interesting things about the original Hawaii 502 is that it's sort of a blend of the cop procedural and also of a spy show, because the main antagonist, even though he only appeared in maybe a dozen episodes over the 240, 250 or so, was Woe Fat, and I think
Well, fact,
he
yes.
appears in the last episode. So he's sort of the Moriarty to McGarrett's Sherlock Holmes.
Very much so. That's the same way I was thinking of it. Played by a wonderful actor, Kai D, who you might recognize from The Manchurian Candidate. He's one of the very sinister Chinese communists involved in the brainwashing scene near the beginning of The Manchurian Candidate. And I always kind of liked to think that in some way he was playing the same character in 5-0. Maybe he had changed his identity. Maybe he had a different cover story. But yeah, I liked to think it was the same character he was playing. But
Yeah,
he's a tremendous character. He appears, I think you're right, 15 times maybe. Always manages to escape
yeah,
at the end. He doesn't exactly outwit McGarrett because he's always foiled, but he manages to get away from McGarrett,
yeah.
drives McGarrett crazy, his nemesis. And that does give it an international flavor, as well as I think some of the stories that are talking about drugs coming in or international intrigue. There are always a few episodes during the run of the series that are good for an assassination subplot where you've got a dignitary coming into Hawaii and some people are bringing their grudges from their countries into Hawaii to act out. And McGarrett always takes those very personally. He is very much Hawaii is my state, and
Yeah.
you don't do these things in my home. So there's that level of intrigue in there. There's also a subtext that someone called clever people doing bad things. And you see several episodes during the course of the series where you see college students or very smart young businessmen who are committing various types of crimes just for the fun of it, just to see if they can get away with it. Sometimes that's as far as it goes. Sometimes their motives are quite uh, not just selfish, but they look at people as playthings, as their inferiors. So they're very malignant. And so, as I say, sometimes they're just doing it to see what they get away with. But that's another popular subgenre that you see in 5 is this clever people committing crimes. And then you have what I would you have mob stories where you have
Yeah.
the Hawaiian mafia or the Chinese mafia or the Hong Kong
The
mafia
Yakuza.
coming in. Yep. So you've got these underworld stories that are going on. And I say you have the drug stories that are going on. So there is, it isn't just the average police show, and it it kind of falls into what we call in my household, it's kind of like uh, Hadley's theory. And Hadley's theory goes that when you see a law enforcement series, the the law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction on it is directly related to the law enforcement agency that the star belongs to. So in Hawaii 5 you see 5 getting all of these international crimes and investigations going. If the same episode had been shown on the FBI would be the ones investigating it.
Yeah.
If it was in a different series, you'd see the regular police doing it. So there's always this, you'd see NCIS, you'd see the
Yeah.
Navy getting involved in it because McGarrett used to be in naval intelligence before he came to 5 So you have these different jurisdictions, and you do have a representative from the State Department or a representative from the FBI that kind of play recurring characters from time to time. And you do see McGarrett picking up the phone and calling his contacts in Washington to get information from the State Department on some of the characters that he's having to deal with. And you're absolutely correct that that is not something you would see on Dragnet or your ordinary police kind of show. So it has a very international flavor to it.
Yeah, there was and occasionally it would have, the serial killer or the psycho killer. Uh, but usually it was probably 20% of the shows were some guy from Las Vegas or from San Francisco is moving in on the territory of some local kingpin. And then you'd have the woe fat stories and the stuff
Hmm.
with the communists, because this was set during the height of the Cold War. I
Yeah.
think occasionally you'd have some references to Vietnam and the ongoing war there, but I don't think they were played up so much.
Yeah, certainly not like it would be when it was in Magnum. Although
Yeah.
Magnum was not dominated by Vietnam, but it was a more critical element of the show than it is here.
Well, because those characters had served.
Exactly.
Um, so let's just talk a little bit about the 50 force, the fictional force. They sort of operate as a sort of a quasi, somewhere between, I guess, the CIA and the FBI, but on a state level, right?
Yeah, there are people when they're talking about the show, they refer to it as the Hawaii State Police. I I suppose, but if you throw out any mention in the show of the 5 being the state police. I think they come closer to being a special branch of the police department that
Yeah.
reports directly to the governor because they do get involved
But
in.
but if I recall, doesn't Honolulu have its own police force? And
It
oh, yeah,
does,
yeah,
yes. So they are called in on the tough cases.
yeah.
Those cases seem to become more and more common as the series goes, so that you start to wonder just where the lines are drawn. And the Honolulu PD assists in a lot of these cases, but it's kind of as if you have Bureau of Criminal Investigation called in on particular cases to investigate what's going on, as well as the cases that have international or national potentials to become involved. It's helpful to have somebody who understands the intricacies and some of the problems that you may have when you're dealing with foreign governments and foreign figures. So I think that from that standpoint, 5 works best as this special unit. But they don't report to anybody but the governor, who's played by Richard Denning, who actually took the role because he already lived in Hawaii and he was retired. And so it was a nice gig for him to come on a few times a year and play the governor.
Mm.
But I do have to wonder how much else the governor gets done because he seems to be very hands on. He trusts McGarrett. He lets him run his own show, but he's very involved in the cases in which he appears. And if there's one thing where I would say that the new 5 may have been right, it's that they make McGarrett's contact the lieutenant governor
Mm.
rather than the governor.
Yeah.
That's getting way deep in the weeds, but I mention that because I like Richard Denning and I enjoy talking about him as the governor. But that it's a very small unit. McGarrett only has 5, 6 people maybe working for him. It's very close knit, and as I mentioned at the outset, McGarrett is very much a hands-on man. He's not an administrator. He's out there making the arrests right with his men. He won't ask them to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. He'll back them up to the hilt no matter what goes on. He'll go to bat for them against the press, against the governor, against the government. He is a tough taskmaster, but in the end, probably the kind of man you appreciate working for because you've got his trust, you've got his backing, you've got his support, and he's a very smart policeman.
So one of the things with Hawaii Five O is it had probably at the time uh, most shows had smaller casts. This one had a fairly large regular cast of 7 or 8 regulars, and then if we the recurring characters, semi-regulars, you probably had a couple of dozen faces that appeared at least 3 or 4 times a year. But before we get into some of those characters, I do want to talk about a thing that is going to be the elephant in the room if it's not talked about, and that's the idea of yellowface in the early years of uh, Hawaii Five-O. You know, that's an offshoot terminology for blackface when white characters would play black people in early motion pictures. And here in the first 2, maybe 3 seasons, from 68 to 70 or so, there were a handful of episodes where we had clearly white actors having their eyes pinned back and doing the hoya honga haya, kind of thing.
Hmm.
And this was a couple of years after George Takei appeared as Sulu in Star Trek. It's a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years before Kung Fu came, and you still had David Carradine playing an Asian character. So talk a little bit about that. Was there any pushback at the time? Because they did eventually drop that.
They did, and I think that you're right. They got away from it. They began to bring a lot of Native Hawaiians into the show, either people who were not professional actors at all, to playing some of the smaller roles, the shop owners, those kinds of things, or actors who had not had wide exposure, but were perhaps better known as entertainers on the islands than they were on the mainland. That, the whole idea of yellowface was probably not as big an issue then as it would be today. Today, we'd be horrified to see some of these things, especially when you do have actors like George Takei who are eminently suitable to play in roles like this. There weren't as many of them back then, and I think it is notable that the show did make the effort to enculturate more of them as the series went on. So I'm not sure what the blowback was at the time, if there was any, but you see, for example, McGarrett's secretary talking about people who were occasionally in the series. McGarrett's secretary for the first few years is white. After that, he has a succession of secretaries. None of them are on for very many seasons. None of them play very important roles, but it's notable that almost all of them are Hawaiians. And you see the Hawaiian lingo coming into the series more. The use of the term bruddah, which I think must be spelled Bruddah. And that seems to be a term among Hawaiians, and McGarrett uses that in his dealings with some of his assistants, some of the other members of the force, especially the Hawaiians. So they do a pretty good job of that. He's always got at least one native Hawaiian as part of 5-0, and for most of the time he had two. And what makes that puzzling when you get to the last season of 5-0, and McGarrett is essentially the only character left from the beginning, the only major. Jack Lord is the only regular left,
Yeah.
except for Richard Denny. But you have William Smith and Sharon Farrell brought into the series as the new members of 5-0, along with Duke Herman Wiedemeyer, who is in from the fifth season onward. And Sharon Farrell is a good move in that bringing a woman into this male-dominated, very masculine, as I said, unit is a very progressive move. They don't do very much with her, but it's a progressive move on the face of it. Still, it's a little unusual, I think, that they didn't take the opportunity to perhaps stress that the composition of 5-0 was more and more resembling the native composition of the islands, especially since that was always an undercurrent, whether we're talking about theft of native goods or native curses being put on people or rival native gangs. Um, it's one of those situations where today, when we talk about law enforcement, we often hear people talking about how you want a police force that resembles the population. And I think that they did an admirable job on that on 5-0, and that's the reason why I say in the final season I'm surprised that they didn't go even further in that. But be that what it may, they did do a very nice job on it, I think, in the long run.
So let's talk about some of the more iconic characters. As I mentioned, the famous catchphrase that everyone knows from that original show was "Book 'em Dano." I don't know if they used it in the follow-up show, but uh, so that's what Dan Williams, Dano Williams.
Yep.
That was what was his name? MacArthur.
James MacArthur, yes, who
Talk a
had
little
a
bit
very good
about
pedigree.
him.
Yeah, James MacArthur was the son of, was it Ben MacArthur? The playwright. I may be getting his first name wrong, but and his mother was Helen Hayes. So he and she even does a guest appearance on the show as as his aunt, I believe, Aunt Clara. But uh, James MacArthur had done some guest shots on different shows. He had, I believe, appeared on The Untouchables as well, and other TV shows. So he's a very good actor, and he is clearly McGarrett's confidant. Danny is his go-to man, his confidant, the one he can trust. He he is, in a sense, a second banana. If you want to define a second banana as someone who does not threaten the status of the lead. And that was the thing that you knew about Danny from the very beginning. He wasn't out to get Steve's job. He wasn't going to undermine him. He was a loyal lieutenant at all times, and there was that great trust factor between the two of them, between Steve and Danny. So that that made him a memorable character. He ran, even though he often didn't have anything to do on the show except cuff people or carry out Steve's orders. He does get some episodes where he gets to play the lead, where he shows more of a personal side than McGarrett does. He lets himself be a little more vulnerable. And when he leaves after the 11th season, and was frank about it later on that he left because he got tired of having a role that didn't really require that much of him. The show really suffers because of his absence more than any other character who's left the show. When Danny is gone, it's as if the foundation of the show is gone. Steve doesn't have those familiar characters around him to lean on. Even though he's the star of the show, he needs those supporting players. And when Danny leaves, he doesn't have them.
Yeah, Dano was the Tonto or the Robin to his Lone Ranger or Batman. The other three characters that I know from the first half, the what we might call the classic 5-0, the last 3 or 4 years being sort of running on fumes a little, but would be Chin-Ho, Kono, and Duke, the characters, and they are all native characters. Well, Chin-Ho might have been. He might have been Chinese, Hawaiian, or whatnot. But
yes,
talk about those. I talk about those three characters because these are after Lieutenant Sulu, probably the three most prominent non or Asian based characters on television at the time.
Yeah, well, Chin Ho is especially interesting because he's played by an actor named Cam Fong. Cam Fong actually had served on the Honolulu Police Department for many years. He was a veteran cop and auditioned for the show. In fact, he auditioned for the role of Wo Fat. And Leonard Goldman, who was the producer, the executive producer, nah, we like you better in this regular role where you're going to be on every week. So Chin is the veteran cop. He has much more experience. He has a very shrewd eye about things, and if he doesn't always get the airtime that Danny does, he's trustworthy, dependable, responsible. If you really he's always got your back. So if you really want the experienced officer on the case, you're going to have Chin involved in it. He reflective, smokes a pipe, has a family. He's a little bit of everything. He has a personal life, he has a professional life, but he's solid as a rock. And when he leaves the series, and I think that's in the 10th season, um, he's actually the only member of the cast who gets a formal farewell when he leaves the series. He's killed off. And it's a heroic death, although I don't think that they make enough of it, either in letting him show off as an actor or in the way that McGarrett takes the death of such a trusted officer. I don't think they make the best use of it, but it's still interesting, and it was at his request that they kill his character rather than just have the character disappear, as was the case with Danny. You know, Danny is at the end of the 11th season, and then he's gone. No mention made of what happens to him in the final season. Not the same with Chin, but again, the series suffers as a result. Then you've got, in the first four seasons, you have Zulu, and people will remember him as a very big physical man. You see him running up the gangplank of a ship in the opening credits. He's the muscle. He is perhaps of all of the supporting players the least smooth as an actor, which also makes him one of the more believable characters in it. We don't know much about him, but he's one of those characters in a series who seems to know a lot of people. Chin has the street smarts and knows a lot of the people out there on the streets. Zulu is, or Kono is the same. He knows a lot of the people in the action. And played by an actor named Zulu. I like him a lot. He plays him for the first 4 or 5 seasons. Then you have Duke, who's played by an actor named Herman Wiedemeyer. He comes in the fifth season, and I think Duke actually started out as a member of the HPD and graduated to 5-0. And he's very good, but he never, by the end of the series, he's the last member of what we might call the golden age cast of 5-0,
Yeah.
aside from McGarrett. Duke is the last one. To my mind, he never rises above the status of being a supporting character. And there is a moment, I'll bring this up now because we probably get to it sooner or later, when we talk about the 12th season, the final season, which most people, most 5-0 fans consider an awful season, the worst season by far over the previous 11. My example of that is that Duke, the bad guy, or somebody lays a curse on McGarrett, prohibiting any native from having anything to do with him. And Duke, therefore, he says, Steve, I shouldn't even be telling you this, but you're a pariah to us. I can't have anything to do with you. Well, Chin never would have said anything like that. None of the other members ever would have said anything like that. And to me, that was a prime example of a show selling out character development and the evolution of the series in return for a plot line. I don't know how seriously people in Hawaii take or took those kinds of things, these curses, these what we might call fatwas, where you're telling somebody you can't have anything to do. I don't know how seriously that was or should be taken, but it is inconceivable to me that a professional in 5-0 who had been bailed out by Steve, who had been saved by Steve, who had been supported by Steve, who'd probably been hired at Steve's insistence, that, to me, it was the jump the shark moment from which 5-0 never recovered. So I wanted that's probably, to my way of thinking, the most notable Duke scene that we have in the series. There's one other regular character, Ben, who's played by Al Harrington, who is an entertainer in Hawaii. I think he might still be an entertainer out there. He was as of a few years ago. Talented. Again, his character is never a character that's going to rise to the level that Chin or Danny did, but he's a solid, good character, good cop, again, a native Hawaiian, and I think he was a good addition to an ensemble. I don't know that he would have made a great character in a smaller cast, but he was a vital part of the scene. You had Harry Endo, who played Che, who is the lab technician, for most of the first 9 seasons of the series. Every time you've got a need for ballistics, or you have a garment where they want to inspect the threads on the material or the dirt in the shoe or anything like that, McGarrett's forever sending it down to Che. And he's always telling Che, I need it yesterday. And Che is always getting this information for him. He's brilliant at what he does. I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but he had become such a familiar face as the go-to in these situations that when he leaves the series, the last 3 seasons are without him, it's a loss that you feel
Hmm.
because you're left wondering what happened to Che.
Yeah.
And you always knew that when Che got you the information, it was going to be right.
Want to just with the Kono character always reminded me in terms of build of the character from, to go back to James Bond, the guy with the hat that cuts off the head. What
Yes,
was it? What was the name of that character? Goldfinger. What the? I can't
Top
remember.
Job.
Top. Yeah, that's right. Right. Although he was the good guy. Now, one of the things with the, because I want to talk about some of the seasons, how the show progresses in sort of broad strokes, but I also talk about some of the episodes episodes that stick in your mind. But 5-0, the original show, is an odd mix in that it is serialized to a degree because of the recurrence of Wo-Fat and a few other lesser characters, villains. And I do know that there's, I think maybe it's a 2-part episode, 6 or 7 seasons in, where we get one of McGarrett's girlfriends that we saw briefly a few years ago, and and she's involved in some kind of intrigue. So we do get a few characters, like you mentioned, Dano. He has, so it's somewhere. It's not completely episodic like most shows was, but it's not nearly as serialized. And so it's an interesting gray zone. What is your
Mhm.
take on where it stands, serialized or episodic?
Well, I think it is mostly an episodic show, but you're right that there are some serialized elements. There's really a very good 3-part um, episode that runs probably halfway or a little further into the series with some very good actors. It's called the overall umbrella title of the arc was V for Vashon, and it had Luther Adler, Harold Gould, and Robert Dreyfuss. And it was a 3-part story. It was about V for Vashon, the father, the son,
Yeah,
and
I
the
remember.
patriarch.
Yeah.
And they were all members of a literal crime family. And you have one case, and you see the 3 of them each getting involved as is required, each one of them as the center of one of the 3 episodes.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because it isn't a typical multi-part show in that you have one element make up each of them. You also have a consistency in 5-0, and this again is why the 12th season bothered me so much. This lapse or this dramatic change in character that you have from Duke, because while it is episodic, again, there are consistencies within the 5-0 universe. You do have the recurring characters, but you also have a consistency in character and a consistency in story. So anything that happens in a given episode does impact the rest of the series to a certain extent. You don't see as an absurd comparison, you don't see a building blown to bits in season 4 that somehow is around again in season 8.
Yeah.
Whatever happens in the series happens, and you don't really contradict it. So that I think is a consistency that goes throughout the whole series. But as far as where it falls on the spectrum, I would say that it mostly falls into a self-contained episodic series with some elements that run throughout the series and an occasional look at bringing in something from the past into the present. You've got Another you've got a couple of other cases I would talk about in that same vein. Hume Cronin plays a wonderful villain in a couple of different episodes. One in, I think, the fourth season, and one in the fifth season. And he's a crook, but he has such a good, benign humor about what he's doing that you can't help but like him. He drives McGarrett crazy because McGarrett can't pin him down. All of the other officers seem to kind of smile about him, although they wouldn't let Steve do it. But there's a wonderful scene, for example, um, where Hume Cronin is setting up this complicated telephone system to bypass certain things and allow him to pick up on certain calls or to bypass certain people. I don't remember the details to it right now, but they're talking about this back at 50 headquarters. And Danny makes this comment about, if we're not careful, he's going to wind up running the entire phone system. And it's a remark that McGarrett would never make because it's too flip. But it's also a remark that Danny makes because he has the humor and he has the perspective to see the implicit absurdity in all of this. Those are a pair of really good episodes. You have Ross Martin playing the mob boss Tony Akia, and Ross Martin is one of those actors that I think automatically makes any show that he's in better because of his presence. He plays him in 4 or 5 episodes, and it's obviously he's continuing to escape from McGarrett until the last episode he's in, where he finally has to pay the price. But it's a continuation of his story, and again, that is another logical aspect of the series. So he doesn't have a story arc per se. I kind of consider a story arc to be one where you're telling a particular story over multiple consecutive episodes, while you may have another story that line that's going from episode to episode. This doesn't work that way because his appearances are spread out, but it's still a matter of consistency, and it's a nice thing because he's again plays the character so well, so charming and so sinister at the same time.
Just looking through some of the episodes, I was shocked. I just saw that the director of a handful of episodes was Nicholas Colasanto, who played Coach
Yes.
on Cheers. I
Hmm.
had no idea that he was a director. I know him from obviously from Cheers, and he was in A Raging Bull, and then another fight film in the early '70s as an actor. I knew him. I had no idea that he directed television.
Yeah, he has a lot of directing credentials to his name. There are many of the shows in our '60s lineup that we watch here where you'll see his name come up in the directing credits. You kind of want to say Coach every time you see it, but he directed a lot of television back in the day, and he was very good at it too. I think that I wouldn't say that he has a particularly unique directorial style, but it's very solid, very dependable. You're not going to see a sloppy episode that he's directing.
One of the episodes, I forget the name of it. I was trying to look it up, but I didn't have the time to look it up. That sticks in my mind is uh, there's an episode where there's a highway near the a beach, and there's a sniper up in the rocks who's just
Yes.
randomly shooting people. And this was I think in the first 4 or 5 seasons, maybe, and it's a young kid. And I was thinking, boy, how prescient, because I mean, yes, there was the Texas school, the University of Texas sniper in like
Hmm.
64, 65, 66. But this was really before we had, I guess you would call it what, not, it's not serial killing, just spree killing. This
Yes.
guy's a spree killer 40 years before the term was. Do you remember the name of that
I
episode?
don't remember the name, but I remember the episode just as you
And and
do.
and the thing is, when they find out, there's no particular reason. The kid is
No.
just wacky, and it's one of those things that I remember because the look on McGarrett's face is he's a man of logic. I mean,
Hmm.
in some ways, he has a respect for Wolfat because
Yes.
he knows that even though they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, he knows he understands the reasoning of behind everything Wo-Fat does, good or bad. But this kid totally blows him away. He can't handle it.
No, he can't comprehend that kind of evil
Yeah.
that doesn't have a motive or a logic behind it. You're right, and it's an interesting take because that wasn't being done a lot in television at the time. I seem to remember an episode of Magnum from a few years later where Magnum encounters somebody who's trying to kill him, and he doesn't know why. And because he doesn't know why, he isn't able to identify who it might be. And at the end, the killer reveals himself. It was something that apparently Magnum did to him in the past, but Magnum never does find out what it was. The killer is killed before the show has that kind of a resolution. So Magnum winds up never understanding what did happen, and this is similar to that, the motiveless crime, and it's even different. It's even different from those clever kids committing crimes that I mentioned earlier, where even though McGarrett can have contempt for their willful disregard for the values of human life and human suffering, he can understand contemptuously, but he can understand what their racket is, well, that they want to prove that they're smarter than everybody else, that they want to do all of this. But this motiveless crime, that's just beyond his ability to comprehend. That doesn't make him stupid. That makes him very much a man of his time.
Mm. Uh, so before we get to talk about Wo-Fat and the whole arc of that character over a dozen years, were there any other 5-0 crossovers? Because you mentioned Magnum exists in the same universe.
Hmm.
What I know that a CBS show is what Hawaii 5-0 was, so it wasn't going to have a crossover with Columbo. I think the FBI was ABC, so it couldn't have
Yes.
had it
Hmm.
couldn't have had a crossover there. But were there any plans to have any kind of a crossover with other CBS shows at the time?
Not that I'm aware of, which almost guarantees that we're going to get some kind of a message from somebody saying, "Well, don't you remember that episode in season whatever?" But having seen the whole series, I certainly can't remember anyone where they were either trying to do a backdoor pilot or did turn out to be a pilot or any kind of an association with another show or a character from a show. All of the repeating characters, Pat Hingle is another one who plays this really arrogant but very smart professor. He appears in 3 different episodes as the same character, but he doesn't appear in anything else. So I don't recall, without committing myself to it, that there was any other crossover.
So let's then speak of Wo-Fat. Now, Wo-Fat, well, it was, I think, either a Chinese agent or he might have been running a ring of Chinese. He seems in some ways to be part of the government, but yet he also has his own sort of criminal aspirations. And he could have very easily fallen into the parodic yellow peril kind of character.
Hmm.
This was only, less than 25 years after World War II ended. So he could have very much been a Fu Manchu, mustache swirling kind of villain. But he does have complexity. So if you could sort of give us a sense of the character over the dozen years of
Hmm.
his appearances.
Well, Fat appears in the very first episode of Hawaii Five-O, the pilot, and he appears in the very last episode of Hawaii Five-O, and he appears maybe a dozen times in between. But you're right. At certain times, it appears that he is very much acting as an agent of the Chinese government, if not actually a member of the Red Chinese. Other times he seems to be more like an arms merchant trying to make deals with the highest bidder. He might seem to be an independent freelancer working with different governments or different countries. There are some that are just kind of amorphous as to what exactly his role is. But without exception, he comes into these episodes and automatically elevates the quality of the story. Um, I remember someone telling me once that they weren't really big fans of the Wolfat episodes. I said, "Well, why not?" And she said, "Well, because you know he's going to get away at the end, and nothing really changes." But for me, that's part of the excitement of the episode. Yes, you do know that Wolfat is going to escape, but you ask yourself how he's going to escape, how he's going to manage it this time, and what the ramifications are of that escape. Now, I'm not aware that the Wolfat arc actually carries any storylines within it over from appearance to
Yeah.
appearance, but you see him involved in these same machinations, and he has a great deal of respect for McGarrett. He's a worthy adversary. Every time he's battling with McGarrett, it's a battle of wits, and the I think that it's a reciprocal feeling. I don't know if you could use the word respect with regard to how McGarrett feels towards Wolfat. He does, however, respect his intelligence. He respects his ability to be able to work out of things. He knows that Wolfat is not going to make a stupid mistake. And he also knows if something is not Wolfat characteristic. So if you might have something committed in the course of the episode, and he would say that isn't Wolfat's MO. So he knows his opponent very well. Um, One of the questions that I have always had is, can you trust Wolfat? There are a couple of situations where he will make a, or he attempts to make a deal with McGarrett. I give you this piece of information for your investigation. You let me escape. Or, you do this, I'll let you live. Would Wolfat actually carry out that? I'm not sure, but the very fact that you're asking yourself this question, that you find yourself wondering, well, I wonder if you can trust Wolfat on that. That is an element of complexity that again you don't see in most villains, either the Fu Manchu type or any other villain for that matter. That you're starting to wonder, is this a man I could do business with? And sometimes you even find yourself thinking, well, if I was McGarrett, I might just let this one go. So um, it it's a wonderful character and a wonderfully played character, a very literate, very intelligent, charming, sinister. All of these different characteristics that are just kind of all knotted into one great big ball. But there's no question that he is not a cartoonish villain. He is not over the top. He's always measured in what he does. Most series, I think, can only dream of having an adversary like that on a regular basis.
Yeah, and the interesting thing that I knew, and then in looking it up earlier too, is he's actually not Asian. The actor Key D was Sudanese and English American actor, so but yet he looks, the classic East
Yes.
Asian look, and so in a sense he is doing yellowface, but it's not it's not as noticeable.
You're right. I can't remember what his real name
It's something
is.
like Key D. Something it's hard to pronounce. I don't
But
know.
yeah, well, and I'm wondering his his actual birth name is where are we at here? I have it written down somewhere here. Now Kenneth Dickerson. um, an American television and motion picture actor of Anglo-Egyptian Sudanese ancestry, and he adapted the name, I think, in convenience to the types of roles that he was playing. But he is a great character, and finally you have everything tied up in place by the time you get to the last episode, where he's taken into custody, where he's arrested. Um, you have a resolution to some questions that go all the way back to the pilot. There's a an issue in the pilot where he tells McGarrett something about McGarrett's that there is something in McGarrett's family history, and if you dig too far, you're going to find it, and you might not like what you find out.
Mm.
And that all winds up being resolved. So I guess when I was talking about story arcs, that's the one exception that proves the rule, that there is kind of a continuation in that. But that's how we see his character operate, with this sinister charm.
Yeah, that last episode is called "Woe to Woe Fat," and I
Isn't
remember
that a great title?
yeah, I remember watching the series about a decade ago when I had Netflix when it came on, and I may be wrong, but doesn't McGarrett finally catch him while running through the jungle, and then he puts him behind bars, I think, and uh, he basically says "Aloha, Woe Fat," and it looks though that Woe Fat has something hidden away where he's
Hmm.
plotting his next breakout or whatnot.
Yeah, it's kind of like Harry Lime in The Third Man. You're not really sure that Wofat's going to stay behind bars.
Yeah.
I don't know if they did that in the event that the show did continue, or if they did some kind of a movie afterward, or if they just wanted to suggest that, as many viewers, I think, would believe, Wofat might be in jail now, but do you really think that you're going to be behind bars? Do you really think he's going to stay there?
Yeah.
That's hard to believe.
So let's talk a little bit about the show and its impact at the time and later on. I mentioned the catchphrase of Bookham Dano, but the show, it wasn't a super hit. It was a consistent ratings winner, but
Hmm.
it wasn't like a cultural phenomenon in the way that All in the Family was, or these shows that stay in the top 10 for 5, 6 straight years. I think it was only in the top 10 2 or 3 seasons,
Yeah,
right?
right at the beginning of the show's run, but it did have its contribution to cultural pop culture. The whole thing about Bookham Dano becomes a catchphrase for a lot of people, and even though most of the time he may just say book 'em, murder one, but it takes on a life just like Star Trek, where he'll say he's dead, Jim.
Or
It
Beam Me
ha-
Up Scotty.
yes, it takes on a life of its own, as does perhaps one of the most curious aspects of the show's legacy, which was the trailer that they would run at the end of the episode for the next
Mm.
episode, where Jack Lord will say, "Here are some scenes from next week's episode," and you'll see a few flashes of it, and he'll give the name of the episode again, and he'll say, "Next week on Hawaii 5-0, be here,
Yeah.
aloha,"
Yeah.
and That's the only example I can think of off the top of my head where something that doesn't actually appear in the body of the episode itself becomes a catchphrase for people. And that's one of those phrases that people use continuously. It's generally misquoted as "be there,
Yeah.
aloha," where what he actually says is "be here,
Yeah.
aloha," but it's the same thing, and it's such an iconic type of a phrase. So there are two phrases that definitely left their mark on the culture. The whole idea of the police as 5-0, that became kind of a catchphrase or a urban slang for police for a while. I don't know if it still is, but for a while people would refer to 5-0. And you knew what they were talking about. You knew they were talking about police. So the show had left a mark in that sense. Although, as we say, it wasn't an enormous hit. It wasn't a culture-changing show, but it was a popular show, and it left its mark. I think a couple of interesting things about it in that regard. It was at the time the longest running police
Yeah.
drama in American television, running for 12 seasons. For the last 4 seasons that it ran, it was the only show to debut in the 1960s that was still on the air.
Mm.
So when it went off in 1980, it not only was one of the few series ever to run in parts of 3 decades, it was also the last show from the 60s to still be on TV.
Yeah.
So it produced a lot of episodes. It produced a lot of memorable scenes, and if it doesn't remain a part of our consciousness, I think it's safe to say that we live in a pop culture that has witnessed the effect of 5-0, even if we don't recognize it ourselves.
Yeah, and actually,
We do. I
yeah,
do because I'm an old guy and I
yeah.
saw it. But a lot of people probably know that part of it without even knowing it comes from the show.
And I do see that it actually did have 283 episodes, so it did outpace its successor series decades later.
They averaged 24 episodes a year for the first 11 years. I think that the final season only had 19. But when you think about how television is structured today, where prestige TV has 10, 12, 14
Yeah.
episodes a season, to be doing 24 episodes a year for 11 years in a row is a tremendous amount of material to have on. And if you find the plots becoming sometimes repetitive or superfluous, or if you're thinking to yourself, well, why didn't they do this instead of that, as I often find myself doing, you have to keep reminding yourself that there are a lot of episodes of Hawaii Five-O, a lot of
Yeah.
words written, a lot of scenes sketched, a lot of shows played out, and it's difficult to have something new every time when you do that much. And if you play your cards right, in the 11th season, not that many people are going to remember what you did in the second or third season.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because in the 50s and the 60s, the scripted series were actually producing in the mid 30s, 35 to
Yes.
39 shows a year. The original Dragnet was doing that. And so, people were saying, well, 24, boy, they're being real cheap. Now, like you said, 10 to 13 is your typical season. That Star Trek Strange New Worlds that I mentioned just had 10 episodes. They were very good. I'll take 10 really good episodes over 24 hit and miss episodes, but still. So let's just wrap it up. Well, first, is there anything else that we haven't spoken of about the original show that you'd like to mention? And then,
there's one episode that I just wanted to mention because a lot of people may only know about it secondhand or through hearsay. It was a second season episode called Bored She Hung Herself. And the overall storyline was a character who practiced a form of yoga with a noose and wound up committing suicide either intentionally or accidentally. The reason I'm not entirely positive about that is because not long after the original episode aired, someone committed suicide using the same technique as was seen on the show, and they filed suit against the show. As a result, this lone episode was never seen in reruns, was never sent out in syndication, and is not included in any of the DVD packages. So I've never seen it, and if you didn't see it in 1969 when it was originally on, you probably have never seen it. I think that there are clips from it that are on YouTube. I would be shocked to find out that there was not a bootleg of the whole episode somewhere, but it's not a great episode by most accounts, but it's one of those very few examples of a show that has so completely been removed from circulation that you can't find it anywhere.
Oh my! And I'm looking at it. It aired just a week into the '70s, January 7th. Director John Newland. Do you know? Does that name?
Yes, one step beyond.
Yes. So it's an interesting. You're getting directors that go probably back to the golden age, and then you
Hmm.
got Colasanto, I guess, who you said was in his prime. I wonder how many. I wonder if there are any like Steven Spielberg's, like with Columbo or whatnot, that directed. Do you know of
I know.
any directors
I
that?
know that Leo Penn directed a few, and Sean Penn's father,
Uh,
and he's not a contemporary director in the way you're talking about with Spielberg, but Penn also directed a lot of television. Herschel Doherty did a lot of TV shows in the day, a lot with Four Star, which was they did Burke's Law and different shows like that. Jack Lord directed a few of them
yeah.
himself, but no, without looking it up, I don't recall anybody that we might recognize as a future star.
So finally, then, as I ask all the time with these shows, for someone who's never heard of the show or just watching it for the first time, uh, why would you say you should watch this show, and why is it great?
You should watch the show because it's got action, it's got suspense, it has some excellent guest stars, it has solid, dependable performances, and it has Jack Lord and Jack Lord is as iconic a star as you would want in a series like this. I've often said that although Hawaii Five-O is grounded in realism, um, Lord Steve McGarrett is kind of an iconic character in that he represents law enforcement in general. Um, I know we talked about this in prepping for another show. That there's one particular episode, don't remember what it is, but McGarrett is pursuing someone down a pier at a harbor, and the crook grabs a gas nozzle from a gas tank and sprays the gas at McGarrett, gets on his face and everything. McGarrett wipes it away and continues the chase. Now, not having thrown gasoline in my face lately, I don't know what actually would happen. But if you looked at that and said, that's preposterous, on the face of it, you would be right. But McGarrett, in that moment, comes to symbolize more than Steve McGarrett, the character in 5-0. He represents law enforcement and its relentless search for the truth and justice, and that no matter what the criminals try, they're not going to escape in the end. They're not going to be able to escape their just punishment. I think that that is a feature, not a bug, of 5-0. And I think it belongs, if not in the pantheon of great shows, I think it is better than good. It's very good and occasionally even better than that. If you if you want to sample the series, by all means, check out the first 2 or 3 seasons. If you find yourself being drawn into it, it's going to be worth it to watch the first 11 seasons. If you have more tolerance than I do, watch the final season. I don't. I mean, I sat through
Well, at least
what
watch the
is
final show.
Yes, yes. Watch the final episode. But I made it through almost 200, and we only watch one episode a week of a show. We don't binge. We watch it as it would have been in the day. So we watch an episode every week. At that point, not including times when we were out or when we were watching Christmas specials or movies or something, we had watched Hawaii Five-O for roughly 5 years, every Wednesday night for 5 years, and bailed on the final season except for the final episode because it was just that bad. I would say get the series, watch it without hesitation. You're not going to burn your mind out trying to figure things out. You're going to enjoy it. It is fun. It is exciting. It is some of the episodes are really thought provoking, but even the ones that aren't are going to provide you with entertainment.
Yeah.
And if what you're looking for is entertainment rather than a treatise on the role of law enforcement in this cultural society in the 60s and 70s, if you're looking for entertainment, you really can't do much better than this.
Well, thanks, Mitch, and I will link to It's About TV, your blog, below here. Anyone can check that out there, and you'll be back soon. We'll talk about another show, or maybe continue our show on the decades. So, thanks again, Mitch, and we'll be
Looking
talking soon.
forward to it as always, Dan. Thank you.